Hi class and welcome to week 10. This week we're going to be focusing on how to use performance assessments for performance type tasks such as writing an essay, running a mile, tying a shoe, making a chocolate chip cookie. Anything that you can perform needs to be assessed. And so we're going to talk this week about several ways you can do that. So far we've been talking about using tests and quizzes and the like to test students' knowledge. Um, Performance assessments test or assess rather students' ability to do something. It still gets at students' knowledge, but because it's not just a paper and pencil, they're actually doing something to show. They perform an activity or they create a product. Because performance assessments can be a little more subjective, they should be assessed using some type of rubric or checklist, and we're going to talk about that in this presentation. Let's look at some examples of performance assessments. You could finish teaching a unit or a lesson, and you could do any of these things to assess, depending upon the topic, students' understanding. You could, if you're a driver instructor, for example, and you've been teaching how to drive and speed limits and laws and things, you could take them out for a road test. That would be a performance assessment. If you're a band leader, you might have them do a musical performance. If you're an art teacher, you might do an art show. If you're a science teacher, you might have them run through a science lab to show that they know how to do something, for example, how to use a microscope. Performance assessments might also be oral presentations. We all remember the book report. That was a performance assessment. It could be a project, and this is quite frequently papers, extended papers, such as your formative assessment assignment or your some of the other papers we do in class are performance assessment. Dioramas, art projects. Multiple step math problems are performance assessments because they require the students to take an action rather than just to spit back information. Something that's not a performance assessment might be math facts because they just have to remember those and write them down. But if they're actually have to do multiple step math problems, that's considered a performance assessment, as are essays. So performance assessments are many and varied, and they all require the students to take an action. There are some disadvantages and advantages to using performance assessments. Some advantages are they're very, very good for measuring complex thinking and skills. So, for example, if you are a writing teacher, you ask them to take an action, write an essay, and you can very quickly see where their writing level is. It encourages assessments using multiple criteria. So, for example, if you're a social studies teacher and you've taught a unit on World War II and you ask them to do a poster project, you can include a lot of different criteria in that poster. For example, a timeline for battle dates, a pro and con, a history, an opinion piece by the student. And so you really get at whether the student understands deeply the topic. Students tend to like performance assessments better than tests, and so you might have less test anxiety. Now, the disadvantages of performance assessments mostly have to do with them being a little more subjective and a little more complex to grade. Because they are subjective, they tend to have poorer reliability. And so you'll recall we've discussed reliability in class. That means consistently scoring the same. So a student who submits a poster to one teacher might get a grade, and another teacher might give a different grade, for example. Limited sampling means that you don't really ask 100 questions like you do on a test. You're sampling very deeply in a few areas. And so rather than a very broad sampling of the student's awareness or understanding of the topic, you're getting very deep or deep sampling of limited topics that the student is aware of. Time, this refers to the time it takes students to do it and also the time it takes you to grade it, which is generally greater than, excuse me, an objective assessment like a test. So when do you want to use performance assessments? Well, you want to use it when you're encouraging an understanding of deep understanding, uh, of reasoning, skills, and when you want to see how they're able to put together a more sophisticated product. You might also use it to see if they can understand how to follow a process through. And this is an important skill that we teach. Can they follow step 1, step 2, step 3? With very complex performance assessments, I always break it up into steps. For example, if you have 6th grade students and they're doing a science fair project, which is a performance assessment, then you're going to have them write their hypothesis first and submit it to you. Then you're going to guide them step by step. You're not just going to say it's due a certain date and not give them support. You can also use performance assessments to understand their work habits because it is more intense and it does require a more sustained period of concentration. Performance assessments are generally authentic, and what does that mean? Well, in the field of education, tests are considered authentic when they target a real problem. So by this, we mean that the learner must have a connection to the problem. Let's say I live and there's in the country and there's a pond in my backyard, and I want to understand why there's a lot of insects in my pond. I might go out and sample the pond water, and I might do that as a science project. They tend to be messy, so there's not a one correct answer. So going back to our poster for the Civil War, there are many different ways that students might approach that opinion piece or that timeline. The best authentic projects have the potential to change actions, attitudes, or beliefs. So when students get into this type of very deep project, they might take on, for example, a community action project where they write letters to the mayor to try to do something that's civic minded, cleaning up pollution or an effort to make people aware of the importance of sunscreen. And a lot of times, authentic projects target an authentic audience. Now, this is something that is sometimes difficult to do, but if you could have the opportunity to have an audience outside of the classroom, and what do we mean by that? Like the example I just gave where the students wrote letters to the mayor, it tends to be a little more engaging and authentic to the students. Here's an example of a very authentic problem that a group took on. Let's say your students love to hike, but there's a guide on the local trail. There's no guide, that should say. They hike the trail and they return. They take pictures of plants and animals, flora and fauna on the trail, and they identify these and create a trail guide app for a hiker that a hiker can download and use. This would be considered a very authentic performance assessment project. Don't think that they all have to be like this, though. Students can get a great deal of satisfaction by the traditional poster and other types of products that they do in the classroom. Here's some more examples of authentic performance tests in science. Dan, an elementary school student, develops a comic book depicting the adventures of superhero Sunny and uses it to alert children to the importance of using sunscreen. Notice again, there's a connection to the problem. Students are engaged. The problem is a little bit messy, and they have to take an action. Carolina, a middle school student, studies patterns of manatee movements and develops a system to alert boaters to slow down when manatees are most active. And Carla, a 10th grade student, learns how to use computer algorithms And working with a local scientist applies her knowledge using big data to predict the likelihood of individuals developing a certain muscular disease. Again, these are all very advanced um, performance tasks in science. Um, don't be discouraged if not all your students get to do something like this. Perhaps your students get to produce posters and other projects, but anytime a student takes an action and can be engaged in a meaningful way, you've caught on to a good performance task. There are ways to assess performance tests, and we're going to talk about three of them: checklists, rating scales, and rubrics. Here's an example of a checklist. Basically, you just list the criteria that you think are important. For example, this is a checklist that could be used for a paper. The topic has been covered in depth, support is provided for the argument, at least 3 reasons are provided, and the paper follows APA format. And then you could use yes or no, or you could assign 0 or 1 points, but basically it's very dichotomous. There's a statement and it's either yes or no. A rating scale is given here. This is a rating scale for kindergarten math milestones. You'll notice that the criteria are listed down the left column. They're broken up into categories, numbers, and numeration. Can the student count up to 20 objects? And then there's a rating scale, never, sometimes, frequently, or always. And you would just check the column that applies. For your formative assessment, I used a rating scale. Notice I don't call it a rubric because a rubric is something very different we're going to see in just a minute. Notice that there are no descriptions in each cell of the table. It's just blank. You have the criteria running down the left and the rating scale running across the top. A rubric, on the other hand, contains very specific wording for each level. And so you still have the criteria, what's important, running down the side, focused organization, tone, mechanical errors, etc. And you still have levels of called indicator levels running across the top. Generally, we rank these from smallest to greatest, or from poorest to best. And it's a good idea to assign some type of point value to them. So for example, a paper that had a poor focus would be that the focus wanders and is not discernible. A paper with an exceptional focus would be clearly stated. And the points total column at the end on the right just allow you to assign the points. The bottom row allows you to add up. So how do you construct a performance criteria? Well, first you have to think about what is a good response. And this is a little harder than it is with a test. So for a poster, for example, what criteria should a good response include? What's important? In your poster, you might have 3 or 4 different areas. You might have a timeline, you might have an opinion piece, you might have a variety of facts, and you could use different types of assessments for each area. Whatever you use, the rating scale, the checklist, or the rubric, it's important to connect your criteria to your learning targets, as we've done all along, even with tests. You put the criteria on rows, as we saw before. It's a good idea to include multiple criteria. Most people use at least 3, and 7, 8, 9 are not unheard of. As much as possible, make the criteria objective and measurable. So what does that mean? It means to avoid words like many or some or few, and try to use numbers and quantities, and so make it as clear as possible with little ambiguity. And then you have to think about how much weight do you want to give each criterion. Maybe you want to weigh writing a little less than content knowledge, for example. You're going to think about the levels of performance that go across the top and what words you want to use. Excellent, good, fair, for example. As we said, 3 to 5 levels of performance usually work best. If you go down to 2, you don't get enough finite grading. If you go more than that, it just gets confusing to the student. Think about what distinguishes a good response from an average response and an average response from a poor response. And then you can begin to write the criteria. It's a good idea through the years to save exemplars that show performance at different levels. So you might have a highest exemplar, you might have a lowest exemplar, and of course you're going to take the names off so that students won't be able to identify who did which. But you can use these models as you go through the years to show students when you repeat an assignment what a good paper looks like or what a good poster looks like. Let's go through and consider a task. Suppose we wanted to judge how to bake, teach and how to judge how students understand to bake the most delicious chocolate chip cookie in the world. And this is one of my favorite things to eat, so I chose that. And suppose I say to you, you'd have to create a rubric to assess this task. In other words, you've taught the students and now they're ready to bake it, but you have to see how good a job they can do. You'll recall from previous weeks that we've talked about holistic and analytic rubrics. Holistic rubrics view the product of performance as a whole, and they describe characteristics of different levels of performance. Criteria are summarized for each score level. Whereas analytic, you break those characteristics out onto their own rows, independently value them and score them. At the top of the column on rubrics, you're going to put descriptors, and they're qualitative. Your book has many examples of these descriptors. You might use things like novice, limited, never, emergent, seldom, proficient. I try to discourage the use of poor, but some teachers use that. So think about the different descriptors that you're going to use for your 3 to 5 levels. One word of caution, don't let the rubric stand alone. You may notice when I grade papers, I always provide feedback. And feedback is a tricky thing because if you just provide too much feedback and you redline everything, the student's going to get overwhelmed and not be able to take it all in. But you want to give enough feedback that's specific about how to improve. So for example, when you do a writing assignment and I write, here are 3 things I want you to focus on in your writing, I actually record that and I keep track of it. And in your next papers, I look to see that you were following my feedback and trying to improve. But the combination of the rubric and the feedback is a very powerful combination. So that's the end of the lecture. Everybody have a great week. So this week in the discussion board, you're going to have to do an activity to design a rubric to assess the deliciousness of a chocolate chip cookie. So how do you get started with that? Well, first of all, you might start to think about what would be the best type of chocolate chip cookie you could eat. What would be the criteria by which you would judge it? So I'll just give you one. For example, you might consider the number of chips per bite. So folks that like a lot of chocolate chips will probably rate that very highly. But it's very personal. You might not like a lot of chocolate chips. So start by making a list of items that should be in so it should be in the best chocolate chip cookies that you would eat. Even if you don't like chocolate chip cookies, I'm going to ask you to pretend that you do. So this list become the criteria for judging the chocolate chip cookie, and they become the criteria that you use in your rubric. Now you may design either a holistic rubric or an analytic rubric, as we've been talking about. Remember that a holistic rubric sort of puts all of those criteria in one row together and then stamps a level on it. So excellent, very good, might be some good levels. And then an analytic rubric has each criterion broken out by row. So what you're going to do this week is just design a rubric and put it in your discussion. And then you're going to comment substantively on one other colleague's rubric. I want this week I'm going to judge those reaction posts on whether you help the person improve their rubric. So if you just say, good job, I really like this, and it's probably not going to get the top score. But if you say, have you considered, I like your rubric, but have you considered this idea or this way of phrasing this, or have you considered adding another criterion, anything that they could use that help improve the rubric? Because the rubric creation project is coming up and we all want to have practice and get better at that. So everybody have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week.